Hello, everybody. Good day. Thank you so much for joining us today. For those who don't know who I am, my name is James Weeks. I'm the author of the book Meditations Across the King's River, African-Inspired Wisdom for Life's Journey. I'm originally from the Caribbean island of St. Croix, Virgin Islands. Uh, I also help people with strategies for emotional, spiritual, and financial wellness. To learn more about me, visit acrossthekingsriver.com. Today, I'm delighted because we have a very special guest with us. His name is Dr. Ron Eglash, Professor Ron Eglash, one of the world's leading authorities in the field of ethnomathematics and a discipline known as ethnocomputing. And one of the fascinating things, there are many things that he does, is he blends science, a bit culture, technology, mathematics. Dr. Eglash, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Happy to be here. Happy to be here.
All right, so Ron, I wanted to say this. Several years ago, I saw a TED presentation that you did that is now famous. And I think, can't remember how many, but more than 1 million views. I can't remember the exact number, but it blew me away. And the reason why it blew me away was because towards the end of that presentation that you did on TED, you said that every digital circuit began in Africa. And you also said that every laptop began in Africa. And that's so provocative. And what you did in the TED presentation, you explained how African divination systems, which is based on base 2 mathematics, made their way into Europe by Islamic mystics around the 12th century. And these Islamic mystics were practicing, they were calling it geomancy, which is the study of the earth. And then geomancy inspired a number of European mystics and mathematicians and scientists like Leibniz. And then you went on to say how George Boole took the binary code, and then I think John von Neumann, something like that, created a digital computer. And there you have it. You took your audiences from talking about the evolution of these divination systems making their way into Europe, and it eventually leading to the creation of the digital computer. So what blows my mind about this, Ron, is that every day people around the world are using digital technology.
Right.
But there's no connection to Africa whatsoever. And so this revelation, in my opinion, helps us to look at not only ourselves differently, but it can potentially help us look at Africa differently and technology and mathematical applications differently. What are your comments about this?
Sure. I was in Senegal, and starting out as a Fulbright scholar. I had just graduated from the History of Consciousness program, but my master's was in engineering, so I was really trying to bring those things together. And I was just looking around for good examples of these fractal patterns that I was describing. Happened to go into the market in Dakar, and there were these guys with piles of sand, and they were smoothing out the sand and doing these divination patterns. In fact, let me see if I can actually show that. Let's see here. If I do my share screen, and I'm going to share the sound system so you can hear him actually talking.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to add this to the stream. Okay.
Yeah, and hopefully you can see that video there.
I can see the video. I would imagine that viewers can see it as well. Okay.
Okay. Well, let me try playing it and see what happens here. All right. So he's smoothing out the sand, and now he's drawing little dashes, and he pairs them off. He connects them in pairs, right? So if there's an odd number, they're not all pairs. There's one left over. If it's an even number, they're all pairs, right? So let me stop there, and I'll show you my little diagram for that. Yeah, so here he is drawing those random dashes, and then here he is pairing them off. So you might have noticed his finger makes this little loop to pair them off, and then he either has one left over, that's an odd number, or they all pair up, and that's an even number. And so if you do that 4 times, in this particular case, it happened to be 1 dash, 2 dashes, 1 dash, 2 dash, right? Odd, even, odd, even. But you could have any of 16 possible combinations. So in computer science, you'd call that a 4-bit binary word. And I saw him doing this, but what confused me was that he only did it 4 times, but then he produces 16 symbols, and you'll see that next in the video here. So he's done it again, and now he's calculating in his head a fairly complex binary algorithm that at the time I didn't know what it was. And that's my fortune he's laying out there. So here's what that looks like. In the next step, what he's doing is he's taking the results of one of those 4 codes, putting it back in, and then using the prior code to generate a new code symbol. And so even though he only starts out with 4, it self-generates the rest of the coding. And he didn't tell me this at first. And in fact, they refused to tell me. They said, we cannot tell you. This is something that, is a spiritual matter. So I had to go through the process of the ritual process of learning how to be a Bamana priest. And of course, I don't know how to tell fortune, right? I explained to them what I was after, and they said, yeah, that's cool. We can show you that part of it, but it would take years of training before you really understood what it means to be a Bamana priest. So I don't want anybody to get the misunderstanding that I'm teaching the secrets of the Bamana here. I asked him permission to film and said, can I show this in the US so that people can see the beautiful, complex mathematics here? And he said, yeah, sure, that's okay. So in that process of that ritual initiation, I had to sleep with a kola nut next to my bed and give 7 coins to 7 lepers. And on the day that he told me it, I had to sacrifice a white rooster. That's part of the Bamana cosmology, the origin story of the Bamana, and so on. So it took a lot to get here, I guess is what I'm trying to say. But once I realized what he was doing, that it was pseudo-random number generation, I realized, oh my gosh, you could implement that in digital hardware, right? So I thought, well, that's pretty cool that we can model it. But it wasn't until I got back to the US and found out that in the history of Western mathematics, this had entered into the repertoire of these European mystics. Folks called it geomancy, right? It was divination with the earth, geomancy. And folks like Leibniz had looked at geomancy as they were developing European mathematics. So Raymond Lull in Spain was one of the folks. And if you look at the cover of Leibniz's book here, you can see that he's drawing on not just mathematics, right? He's drawing from a lot of these alchemistry and alchemy and these mystical ideas that were available to him at the time. So that's where I'm just going to stop the presentation there. So that was the basis for trying to explain that in the book, right? Is that ethnographic experience of actually learning this from the folks who held that knowledge, getting their permission to make public that one little piece of it. And again, I emphasize, the whole time I was learning it, they were kind of shaking their heads going, dude, this is not how you become a priest. And I kept saying, I know. I just want to document this beautiful recursive mathematics, right? But what was so disappointing to me in the reception, I got the excitement that folks have that this is actually the basis for the binary code. Leibniz is the one who introduced the binary code, right?
Right.
And I got the excitement that generated, but I felt like something was lost there in the translation. So the most important thing from my point of view is not what Leibniz took from this, which is the idea that you can have a base 2 arithmetic, just like we have a base 10 arithmetic. Our computers use a base 2 arithmetic. It's not just the idea that you can have a base 2 arithmetic, but the Bahmana were doing it recursively, which is very sophisticated, right? It takes many years until folks start to explore pseudo-random number generation, and years after that until they develop this concept of chaos theory, of a non-repeating deterministic sequence, right? But of course, nobody's eyes light up when you say a non-repeating deterministic sequence, right? Their eyes light up when you say digital tech. And so that's the part that everybody has kind of publicly picked up on. But I think the real story behind it is much more important, much more significant.
Sure. So by the way, we welcome questions. So I want to say this though. So one of the things that your work has done for me is, as I reflect on your work, I also think of my mentor in my spiritual tradition. His name was Dr. Afolabi Ipega, and so he was teaching me Yoruba divination. He was teaching me what's known as Ifa divination. And the reason why I'm connecting it here to your work is I would sit down with him. We would be gathered around a table, and he would be showing me these patterns, or what you might say are bits or whatever. And he would tell me, oh, this is a binary system, and it's based on the math, base 2 mathematics. And so when I was studying this, I was just thinking about, I'm learning, of course, something that comes from Africa. But when I saw your work, that's when I connected it to the broader world. It's like, wow, no, this isn't just about, African culture per se. I mean, it's not just about African spiritual. This has broader implications. This
Absolutely.
is connected to the world, the whole world beyond us.
Yeah.
Yeah. Could you speak to that? Or
Yeah. So I said, what popped out to me, what was so important to me, and forgive me for going back and forth with these presentations, but I'm going to share my screen again, if this will allow me to. There we go. What is so important to me was this recursive part, right? The fact that you're feeding back what came before in order to produce the new thing that comes next. And the reason that's so important is that a lot of the problems we have today are from the lack of recursive structure. Instead of doing things from the bottom up in a generative way, we do things top down, right? So we have the head of the corporation telling everybody what to do, or we have the head of the military telling everybody what to do. But that's not the way that nature works, right? Nature self-organizes. It's bottom up. It's adaptive. And so if you think about the difference between these top-down leaders that are imposing order upon the world, it can be quite destructive. Whereas our bottom-up process produces things like Wikipedia. Wikipedia is a bunch of experts telling us what the knowledge of the world is. It's us creating that knowledge, right? It's a crowdsourced dictionary. If you look at open source software, it's doing exactly the same thing. It's saying, hey, a bunch of people can get together and create their own software, right? So things in nature, or things that radically rethink the way that we're doing computers, offer this opportunity to rethink the kinds of economic bottlenecks, the lack of democracy that we're seeing. And it's not just the case of Leibniz. It's in other cases as well. So if you look at MIT in the early 1970s, there was a group there called the Architecture Machine Group that was trying to figure out what should the computer architecture be. And they started looking at examples of physical architecture around the world. So Negroponte, who was leading the group at MIT at the time, got a hold of this book, Architecture Without Architects. And lo and behold, the major examples in that book are from Africa. So this is a picture out of that book that the MIT folks were looking at when they came up with this idea of things like open source and bottom-up computer architecture, right? So looking at these fractals in Africa, it isn't just, as like you were saying, it isn't just sort of vindication, right? See, we told you so. Africa isn't primitive, it's sophisticated. It's beyond that. It has implications for thinking about how to restructure the way that we do science and technology. So if you look at the problems of pollution today, or you look at the problems of labor exploitation, or you look at the problems of racism and the sort of colonization of our streets by police forces and corporations, these are all problems in which somebody at the top is extracting value from those who create it, right? Whether it's the ecosystem creating the value, or workers creating the value, or communities creating the value. And you would think that that's just capitalism. And if we got rid of capitalism, that would solve the problem. But in fact, you see the same tendency in communism. So if you look at the history of the Soviet Union, for example, you've got this very wealthy, Politburo. There were almost no workers represented in the upper echelons of the communist government. It was the same old fat cats, right? And so you're extracting value for the state, just like in capitalism, you extract value for corporations. So what's valuable about those indigenous traditions is the way that they do biomimicry. They're looking at how nature circulates value. It doesn't extract value and cause waste. Instead, anything that we would consider waste goes back into the soil as compost, right? But of course, our minds are so colonized, we have a hard time seeing that. So when you go to these African villages, people think throwback, they think ancient, they think, oh, that's so primitive, the way that people are getting this bark off a tree, not saying that's what we need to be doing in the future of technology, right? We need a circular economy. We need a circular ecosystem in industry, in the way that traditional folks are taking something from the forest, turning it into ink or textiles or whatever it is, and then putting that ecological value in the form of organic waste back into the forest, where it can allow biodiversity to blossom. So we don't see that sophistication when it's sitting right in front of us. And of course, in the case of fractals, part of the problem is that the West didn't even know about fractals until the 1970s. And there were, early versions of that with George Cantor in the 19th century. But those were all in the back of the math book, some obscure, weird thing about non-differentiable curves. It wasn't until computers came out in the 1970s and Benoit Mandelbrot started visualizing some of these fractals, and he realized, well, wait a minute, those are organic shapes, So at the time I came into fractal geometry, there were no models of African villages. It was all models of nature. But it occurred to me that these shapes that I was seeing, whether it's a rectangles of rectangles of rectangles or circles of circles of circles, that these were profound revisions of what it meant to be doing architecture and design and technology. So I just spent my whole year as a Fulbright scholar traveling around Africa, gathering these examples and then interviewing folks and asking them, what's the recipe? What's the algorithm? How do you go about doing this? And in some cases, they could give me a very definitive recipe. In some cases, there was some sacred prohibitions against telling me, but I could at least document the outcomes of what it was. That part was public. And in some cases, it just opened up whole areas of exploration.
Wow.
I don't know if you've seen the TV series that Samuel Jackson produced titled Enslaved.
No, I haven't seen it, but I've heard about it.
Oh, great. So one of the six, I think it's episode 5, They brought me to Ethiopia, and we shot this picture of me standing in front of this fractal church in Ethiopia. So if you look at the roof of this church, you can see the cross within the cross within the cross, right? And here on this side of the wall, you can see the tree of life inside of that circle. And on the opposite side of this is a human skeleton buried in the wall. The bony foot is sticking out of the skeleton. But it's quite clear that the curvature, nonlinear curvature of this staircase is trying to tell you that as you go from death to life, right, you climb the curves of growth, you climb the curves of life, the fractal tree of life. So really beautiful convergence between the geometry and the symbolism there.
Beautiful. Excuse me, one moment, Doctor.
Yeah.
So we have a question coming in from Joel McPhee. So he's asking the question, he's saying, I'm going to read his question. I don't know if you can see it, but it says, I'm not a mathematician, but can you speak to the correlation between patterns in numbers and patterns in nature from a math perspective? And then he's asking me, James, also this pattern recognition as applied to Yoruba spiritual divination. So I'll answer his part of the question first. So Joel, so when we're looking at these, so in my tradition, we call these patterns Odus. That's the name. That's what we call these patterns. And so when we are looking at them, like as we're doing divination for clients, one of the things that we're looking for is we're ranking all of these patterns that we see. And this ranking system that we know internally helps us to know like precisely in what area of a client's life they need to focus on, or where there's a potential issue. So it might be that, okay, this client is about to have a health issue, they're having a health issue now, or they're having a relationship issue, or maybe they're having an issue with their emotional health, or maybe there's a legal issue going on. So it gives us, because we once we know certain variables we can work from, we can pinpoint what to talk about or what to address or what's coming in the future. So when I'm doing a divination for someone, I could know, okay, this person is going to have a child, or there's a health issue coming up. This is how we use this. And so what we're doing is we're using this, our ancestors, my mentor said that these systems were taught to us by spirits. You know, spirits are the ones who taught us and laid out these patterns and gave it to us. And so it could use, but it could be used in such a wide variety of ways. We can use it to help someone pick a career path. We can use it to help someone pick a better relationship. We could use it to pinpoint issues in a diet. I mean, there's so many ways. It's like unlimited, you know, the limited ways in which we could use divination. And so, Dr. Eglash, I'll have you respond to.
Yeah. Can you name some of those the Yoruba spirits? I know Legba is one.
Right. So like what you're talking about, those are what we call like, yeah, spirits or Orisha. So Elegba would be one, or Eshu would be an alternative word, or Shango or Yemaja. But the patterns that you were showing earlier, like the recursive patterns that like, they all have names. Every one of them have names within our tradition. So for example, part of what you were showing earlier is part of a pattern that we in our tradition, we call it Oshemeji, which, and I know Baba Irwin is online, so he could speak to that. So one of the things that may refer to as doubt within someone or lack of confidence. So all of these patterns, in our case, there are 256. All of them have names. And
let me ask. Now that I've got this slide up, and I hope you can see that slide, you may have to stick it into the stream in order for folks at home to see it.
I see it. Let me see if I could add it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So my exposure in Benin was with Vodon. So it's related to the Nigerian pantheon, but doesn't completely map onto it one for one. But what I was particularly interested in was that some of the gods seemed to be gods that were cyclic. So they were creating orderly patterns in the world. So Dan, the serpent in Benin, is a serpent who can bite his own tail, right? And so he's a serpent who can do the cycles of the moon, the cycles of the sun. When you see waves in the water, having a cyclic pattern. That's Dan at work, right? And then other gods were tricksters. So in opposition to Dan being a god of order, the trickster gods were gods of disorder. And so it's a little bit hard to give you a picture of disorder. Much easier to give you a picture of order, but you can see at the top there, I've got the cyclic gods represented by one of these metal sculptures of Dan as a wavy snake, and the trickster gods represented by somebody casting the Kuri shells, right? But in between the order and the disorder were the high gods, who, as far as I could tell, were the ones more connected to the power of life, and they tended to be more represented by these fractal shapes. So I don't know if all of that sort of makes sense within the way that you're thinking about it. Let me see if I can get another. That's enough for me to say about that.
All right. So we have another question here, and we could pivot back to that. So this is from Turning Tide. So thank you for this fascinating talk, Dr. Eglash. Do you see these same fractal recursive pattern influences in other cultures, such as Asian, Latin cultural practices, arts, architecture, mathematics throughout history?
So every culture, as far as I can tell, every culture seems to have a set of these sort of geometric themes or mathematical themes, and they work quite differently in different cultures. So I think one of the dangers of that colonial mindset is to say, there's Europe, which is civilized, and then there's the uncivilized, and so everything gets thrown into the same basket, right? But I work with Native American communities, and I've worked a little bit with folks in India and South America, and it's quite amazing how once you catch on to that particular culture's geometric themes, you start to see it everywhere, right? So for example, with Native American groups, you'll often see something that has fourfold symmetry. So if you look, for example, at Navajo rugs, you'll see, there's reflection across the y-axis, right, the vertical axis, and reflection across the horizontal axis. And if you ask folks about that, they'll say, "Oh yeah, well that's the four directions, and we have four sacred colors, and there's four sacred mountains." So that fourness, that sense of fourfold symmetry, just ripples across all those different Native American communities in many different ways. Four poles of the teepee, if you're out in an area where folks are making teepees, but it might be something like here in Michigan, we've got that tradition of the longhouse and the wigwam, and so you have one door to the east and one door to the west, right? And so you're thinking about these axial orientations. So it's very much about that fourfold symmetry, and then the disorder part of it is again the trickster. But the trickster is very different in Native American cultures than it is in African cultures. In Native American cultures, the trickster is random. It's one damn thing after another. And maybe that's why gambling is such a huge thing in traditional Native American cultures, as well as today with gambling casinos, right? Is because there's always been this interest in a kind of trickster randomness to the world. If you look at Native American genetic resources, when Europeans arrived, you'll see this incredible variety of plants. So a lot of the things, even things we think of as African plants, are actually Native American plants. Cassava, for example, everybody in Africa knows. Corn, everybody in Africa knows. But those are New World plants. They're not traditionally African plants. So when Europeans arrived, they were astounded. There were things they'd never seen before. Tomatoes, never seen tomatoes before. Potatoes, they'd never seen potatoes before. I don't know what the Germans were eating with their sauerbraten, or Russians were making for vodka, but it wasn't potatoes. That's a New World plant. And the reason there was such an explosion of biodiversity in the New World is because Native Americans understood nature to be random. One year it throws a flood. The next year it's a drought. The next year it's a bug pestilence. The next year it's a fungus pestilence. How do you keep up with the tricks, with the random trickster of nature? by having a set of genetic resources that are equally random, equally diverse, right? So that's why you had that profound genetic diversity among Native Americans. So that theme of contrasting the fourfold symmetry of order and the randomness of disorder has a particular meaning for indigenous groups in the so-called New World on Turtle Island. In Africa, it's completely different. So in Africa, the trickster story wouldn't be Coyote, the trickster, accidentally knocked over a blanket full of mica dust, and that's why the stars are in the sky. Classic Southwestern trickster story for Native Americans, right? In Africa, the trickster story would be more like this. There's a man who goes into the forest and he sees a skull on the floor of the forest. And he says, huh, I wonder how you got here. And the skull turns to him and says, talking brought me here. And he runs back to his village. He says, hey, I found a talking skull in the forest. Everybody come. So they all come out. And he says, okay, do your thing. Nothing. And the chief says, this man tried to draw us away from guarding our field so he could steal all of our food. Off with his head. So they decapitate him. Everybody leaves. And then the skull turns to him and says, how did you get here? And he says, talking brought me here. Right? So the story folds back on itself. It's recursive, just like we were seeing the numbers in binary divination recursive, or like we were seeing the self-generation of these African villages being recursive. So yes, they both have disorder. They both have tricksters, but the tricksters for the Native Americans are stochastic. They're random, like rolling dice, whereas the trickster in Africa is a trickster because it's recursive. You don't know what's coming when the thing folds back on itself, right? It's that unpredictability of the pseudo-random number generator. So similar cases of contrasting order and disorder, but played out in very different ways in different cultures.
Good, thank you. Question for you. So could you talk about how this work is being used today, like your work with fractals? And could you, for those who are not familiar with fractals, could you just briefly talk about maybe what fractals are, and then talk about modern day applications, the work that you're doing in Detroit with students, the architecture in, for example, in Ethiopia, and all of the different ways in which, you know, these fractals are being used or can be used to help us?
Sure. Yeah, so let me go back to my slides here because it helps me to have a picture of things when I'm talking. And I'll share that. And if you can get me back onto get my pictures back onto that stream. So I was talking about the fact that it isn't just fractal symbols, right? These are actually recursive economies. And so thinking about, you know, how do we bring the wisdom of doing things in that circular way together with some of the power of contemporary technologies is that process of decolonization. So a few of the things that have come out since the African Fractals book, there was this project in Ethiopia. They were going to build this big shopping center, and the architect for it, Xavier Vialta, had read the African Fractals book and said, "Yeah, let's use a fractal set of perforations in the building." The perforation, since the human lung is also fractal, right? It's a branch of a branch of a branch, and here you have perforations within perforations within perforations. So the building sort of breathes, and there's so much air circulation that it actually enabled them to eliminate air conditioning. That brought down the cost per square foot. So when I visited there in 2019, there were all these little mom and pop shops there. And Addis Ababa, you know, it's a huge, tons of skyscrapers and things. I mean, it's very well developed, but it's all these expensive European brands. There's no little local stores. And so seeing all those local shops get set up in this building was just such an exciting development to have come out of taking those indigenous fractal algorithms, but then using them for this very practical purpose, right? It shrank down the carbon footprint. It's better for the environment, and it made things cheap enough for the local economy. Also, folks have just been using it in really imaginative ways. OCAD University in Canada had a Black Fractals conference. And I wasn't involved in that at all. But that was sort of the point, right? To get my big head out of the way and just have people feel a sense of ownership over fractals as part of the repertoire of Black production, African heritage. And then folks have been using it in literature and science fiction and so on. We also have the set of design tools, culturally situated design tools. And so everything's free and available to anybody who wants to use it. So if you just go to csdt.org, CSDT stands for Culturally Situated Design Tools, and you want to do some cornrow fractals, for example. For younger kids, we have it set up more like a game, right? Because the young kids want to just click on things all day. And so, there's a little, can you identify the celebrity cornrow styles in this, right? But also some serious stuff. And so the kids have this little game where you can match up the ancient hairstyles and the newer hairstyles. So something that's pretty engaging for the kids, but also gets them into, the real history of this stuff, right? How it survived the Middle Passage and came out in hip hop. And then we've got some images from Black Panther. So some of the ways that some of those fractal cornrow styles appeared in Afrofuturism. Another little game here from the book Binti, where this young woman braids her family history using a binary code in her hairstyle. So here I can say BINTI is a great book for Baba James. So this is a color code, right? So the letter A would be red and so on. But now that I've created my little braid, now I can squish it together. I can translate it by more, right? I can rotate it. And what's especially important is the fractal scaling. I can dilate it. And so the kids get to use, mathematics like a paintbrush here, right? It really becomes a fun creative tool. And then when they get to the software, they can jump into programming. And so we have it set up kind of like Scratch, the program from MIT, where it's just blocks-based programming. And so pretty quickly the kids say, oh, well, what if I repeat it 200 times instead of 25? Well, that makes a longer braid. And now I've got this logarithmic spiral that you can see in nature, right? And then I can say, well, what if I scale it down a little slower, not 95%, but say 99% shrinkage. And so now it takes longer for it to spiral in. So the kids are pretty great at just picking this up and playing around with it and kind of getting an intuitive sense for what these things mean that, in a math class where you're just crunching a bunch of equations because you don't want to flunk the exam, it's hard to feel that, right? And then the next step is actually getting a chance to render these things physically. So get it off the screen and into your life. So fun ways of using paper sculptures with that or 3D printing. And then once we started doing 3D printing, some of the cosmetologists, folks who own braiding salons that we had been going to just to make sure that we were authentically representing, their ideas and their practices, those folks said, well, why don't you do this for adults? We'd like to get educated in this stuff too. And so that's where we got this new NSF grant. Let me put in the little picture of the award that we got here. So this is our grad student, Matt Garvin, at University of Michigan School of Information, chatting with Dawn Smith, who's a textile artist in Detroit, in her studio here. And we've equipped her with direct-to-garment digital printer. And so she can now use those designs I was just showing you and come up with her own patterns to put on the cloth. We have another project we've been doing in Ghana, and that is africanfuturist.org. And so we shipped a laser cutter to the group in Ghana. And so if you go onto their website, you can see the garments that they've been cutting with the laser cutter. Looks like we're a little bit slow getting to that, but let me just go back to what I was showing you before. So here's some of the projects we were doing with the students, we've got, oh, yeah, there we go. So this is the africanfutures.org. They've got their laser cutter set up, and then they've got the older generation with sewing machines, and the younger generation with the laser cutter. And so the idea is bringing together, the older and younger groups. And then that got us involved in some of the kente cloth weaving in Ghana. So I have another student here, Kwame Robinson, who's an expert in artificial intelligence. And so he's developed a AI app that can take a photograph of kente cloth and tell you whether or not it's fake kente cloth that was produced in a factory and shipped in, under the rug, so to speak, or whether it's real authentic kente. Ultimately, what we want to be able to do is to now have that identified by the buyer. So a tourist comes in, takes a picture with their cell phone, and it would connect them, hopefully, with the folks who actually wove that cloth, right? So you don't want to just be authenticating at point of sale like a capitalist. You want to say, well, let's create a relational economy. Let's start networking at the grassroots instead of letting, Amazon or whoever it is be the folks who run that show. So in general, just to sum up here, what we're trying to do is go back to those circular economies, but the technology is playing a kind of restorative role here, right? Our societies have been wounded, have been damaged by capitalism and all sorts of imperialist forces. And so if technology can kind of make those connections that have been broken, hopefully we can go back to a more generative relational economy. So let me stop sharing there. And
question. So we have a
yeah.
question that came in from Joel McPhee. And so he's asking, like for people who are not as versed in your world, he's asking, well, what simple ways can we incorporate these concepts into our individual lives, I guess on a day-to-day basis? And are there maybe other books or things that you can recommend?
Yeah. So there's in the list of things there, astrology is one of them. That's not my field. You're the spiritual expert here. You're gonna need to field that.
Okay. Yeah. So, but to his other question about how incorporating some of these
Oh,
concepts into
sure.
our
Yeah.
what would you say?
Yeah. So one place to start would be the website Generative Justice, all one word. So if you go to the Generative Justice website, we have all of our publications on there. Everything we do is open source. So if you go on our website, you'll see DIY, do it yourself at home, digital sensing for composting, and how to go buy a laser cutter to do your own laser cutting. And we have a beautiful fractal modeling tool that it's just mouse driven. You don't have to know any math or any coding or anything. Anybody can pick that up and start to use it. And I'm happy to answer email if folks email me with questions about how do I use this particular thing to make jewelry or whatever it is I'm trying to do. All right. So now the spiritual question.
All right. So I'm not an astrology. Joel, he's asking me astrology. I'm not an astrology, but I feel, I mean, a simple answer I would give, I feel that we just have to find more ways to encourage and implement, just science, math, engineering, and technology into our lives, and to stop looking at things as being separate, and to stop thinking of a spiritual path as being devoid of technology or devoid of mathematics. So I would say just finding ways to integrate all of these things that seem diverse. So one of my mentors once said that in some ancient cultures, they didn't look at science as being one thing and math as being another thing. They looked at it as being wisdom. All of it was just wisdom. So there's science wisdom, there's math wisdom, there's divination wisdom, but they looked at it as all of them as branches of wisdom. So I think that's one of the challenges for us, Joel, is to integrate things, and to expand how we define spirituality, because we often define it in such a very limited, isolated, tunnel visioned way.
Yeah,
which
yeah,
which restricts our growth. So even, for example, as we think about it, okay, there's a lot of people interested in African spiritual traditions, great, but they enter these traditions thinking, well, maybe they have to be a priest or a priestess. Well, no, they could be a scientist, they could be an
there
engineer.
you go. Yeah,
Maybe.
I because of that NSF grant, we've been able to do a lot of work with urban farms in Detroit,
Okay.
and a lot of those folks are asking, how do we bring back African heritage plants and grow them? And so we've set up. We now have an African futurist greenhouse at the African Bead Museum in Detroit. Hope folks will come visit us. I'm there 1 or 2 days a week. And so we've been growing these African heritage plants, and so folks come in and they'll say, indigo. I know things get dyed with indigo. I didn't know it came from a plant, right? And so seeing indigo for the first time, and then the guy who runs the bead museum, Oleme Dobbles, his daughter Aleki has a clothing shop that's connected to the museum, and so we've been working with her to take the plants, the indigo plants, and produce our own indigo dye and help her dye some of these adinkra patterns into the clothing line that she has there. So there's great ways of bringing back some of that heritage through things like plants. I know we always think the wisdom must be in the books or the lectures, right? But once you start growing the plants, you start to realize, oh my gosh, our ancestors knew what they were doing, and there's just some beautiful examples of that.
And that's so profound, and I'll tell you why. Because as many people who gravitate to our tradition, they know, I mean, in theory, that it's okay, these things are based on nature. They know that, oh, these things are based on wisdom of nature, whatever. But you don't find a lot of us present in ecology, or we're not connecting it. Many of us are not doing a good job connecting it to gardening. I mean, simple things like, what about having a garden or a
Yeah,
community?
yeah,
There's so many gaps. There's just so many, I guess, silos, intellectual
absolutely. Yeah,
silos,
yeah.
which is stopping us from evolving, basically.
Yeah, and the bead museum, it's really just a little shop that sells beadwork, right? And Dobbles had this vacant lot next to him, and so he started taking all the things that folks had thrown out, old pipe and mirrors and stuff, and assembling these beautiful African sculptures out of them, right? So people start showing up, and suddenly the bead shop is doing really well. So he says, "Well, I'm going to call it a bead museum." So he just got awarded the Kresge Artist of the Year by the city of Detroit. It's really been a terrific, vindication of what he's been doing for the last 30 years. But when I went into his bead shop, the whole plant conversation got started because I was looking at the beads and going, well, wait a minute, that's not a piece of clay or piece of glass. That's actually a seed, right? Africans were wearing these beads made of seeds. And so one thing led to another, and now we're growing those plants that become the African necklaces. We're growing those in the greenhouse.
Beautiful.
Yeah. It's called Job's Tears. If anybody wants, you can just go online and buy it, or visit our bead shop, and we sell the packets of seeds right there. And so starting to get that relationship with the plant, right? That now I'm wearing the plant. When I was living in Senegal, I had mint tea every morning, and so we grow a variety that's peppermint, and it's chocolate peppermint. So you just cut off a piece of the live plant, throw it in boiling water, and it's flavors you cannot get from a bunch of dried up mint leaves, right? Just completely changes the characteristic of it. And so starting to develop those relationships with the plants, that you're coming up with different culinary approaches, right? And starting to tune into what the plant wants. I just ordered for the first time Bambara ground nuts, and I've never grown Bambara ground nuts. In fact, I don't know anybody who's growing them. But it turns out that UNESCO, the United Nations scientific arm, has been looking into those because they're extremely drought resistant, extremely nutritious. They have all these amazing properties. You don't have to add fertilizer to the soil. They pull nitrogen out of the air because of bacteria that grow in the root nodules. These plants can have profound consequences once we tune into that. And of course, plants are just one part of that repertoire. right? There's lots of other things you can do around thinking about the sustainability of what we wear and the labor practices we get involved with.
Beautiful. So we're almost out of time. So, but I want to ask you one more question. So, knowing what you know now, and think as you reflect on the work, the legacy that you're creating, as you look to the future and you think about fractals, what would you like to see more of? I mean, what if you had your wish, if it went your way, what would you like to see?
Yeah. Well, for me, it's all about the grassroots, right? So I hang out in Detroit a lot, and we've got all these community participants, but they're all struggling quite a bit, and so that amazing creative power is not getting the resources that it is. So if we could just spend, 100th of our military budget went to folks in the inner city and folks at the grassroots of every ethnicity. We wouldn't have these alt-right neo-Nazi nutcakes complaining so much if they didn't feel threatened. I mean, the rates of opiate addiction in those communities has been sky high, right? And so they're looking for a scapegoat, and people tell them, oh, blame it on these immigrants or whoever. You could solve a lot of problems if you just started delivering the kind of resources that we deliver to Zuckerberg and Elon Musk. If you delivered those to the grassroots.
Wow, profound. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Eglash. It's been wonderful, and so
Thank you.
I'll be sharing some of your links, on my website, and I'll think of other ways to continue this conversation so that we can
please
integrate more of this into our. Because as you know, because there's not enough of us in these spaces. It's just undermining our communities. So, I hope to encourage others to, okay, how can we integrate these things in practical ways that, take us all to the next level. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye now.